Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. All right, man. So, I pushed through another game. This is like a record. No, I'm playing. I mean, it's a lot of games for me in one day. But I went ahead and got the round 4 game between Wesley and Levon Aronian. Yeah, this is a game with a lot of chances, man. For real. Let me get this fixed real quick. Just a touch, nothing serious. But yes, like I said, it's a round 4 game, and so let me see, Armenian. I have Mabuhay to everybody that's coming from the Philippines. Kamusta na? Aking makaibigan. I appreciate you guys very much. Masaya Komakita Kamuli. I appreciate you guys very much. I did forget Armenian. I know I have Armenian though. Oh yeah, Vogjuven, Inch Beses. Thank you very much for stopping by, or Miss C. Appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. It's just been like an insanely long time since I've done that, so I had to refer to my notes. But yeah, if you guys are ready to go, let's take a look, see what we have for this game. So we got knight to f3, we got d5, g3, c5. So kind of like some Sicilian-like look, but it is a King's Indian attack. We do see bishop to g2, knight to c6. We got d4, knight comes to f6. We got castles. We got e6, and then we do have c4, and we have transposed into actually a Catalan opening. So you guys know you get to this position, a seriously different way. You would go something like this here. Go knight to f3, d5, castles here, c5 here. Knight to c6 here, and then I believe you would be there this way. Yes, after the pawn took. Yep, same thing. Okay, so I did blindly do that, but that is how you would get there in this way. And like I said, you do have pawn takes c4, and so pawn takes c5, and you have queen takes d1. All really standard stuff. We've seen this like millions of times. Rook takes d1. We got bishop taking c5, and knight b to d2. And you want to be kind of careful going b5 because, like I said before, you do have a possible knight movement, even going here, so you can get the the rook for the knight. So the normal way that black does away with the fact that you are attacking this pawn, they just push it to c3 and get rid of it that way. So after we see pawn takes c3, castles by black. Knight comes to b3. Bishop has many different options of where they can go, but we see bishop to e7 in this game. We got c4. Bishop comes to d7. We see bishop to b2. So, I mean, both sides are fairly equal. White has a slight advantage, but it's nothing crazy. But, both black and white have both gotten all their pieces out. You kind of do just have this a little bit of a weakness here in this c pawn. So you got to kind of watch that. We do see rook f to d8, a knight f to d4, rook a to c8, a knight to b5. Throwing a little tickle on this pawn if we can successfully capture here. So we do have b6. We see knight to d6. Rook comes down to c7, and then we have bishop to a3. And man, that knight is in there. It is like super duper, like in black's throat for the long run. So we got knight to e5. Knight comes back to b5. And this is kind of, it's not a no-brainer, but this is like obviously the best move to make. Bishop takes, b5. And it's really important that you throw this Zwischenzug or Zuzul? Schweizenzug. The Schweizenzug move in here. Rook taking d8 with check because with this knight being taken off the board, this bishop is now undefended. So you have to be careful about that. So rook takes d8, bishop takes d8. You see pawn taking b5, knight down to c4. You have bishop up to b4. You got bishop to e7. And for those of you that are wondering, we are still in known theory. We actually have quite a while before we get to the novelty of the game. Bishop takes e7, rook takes e7. We see rook to c1. Like I said, this is super solid for white. This is actually a considerably better position for white than it is for black. White has a little bit more space. They have this bishop in the open position. They kind of have these pawns frozen over here. So, they definitely have a lot going for them. So the knight comes to d6. We see knight to d4. We got G5, and then we do see knight coming to C6. It was also definitely a good move to go bishop to C6. This knight would be a little bit more free. And of course, you know, if you have a piece that tries to take this bishop off, you know, you always have pawn recapturing here, which gives you a passed pawn, so that's always good. But we do see, like I said, knight to C6. We see a rook over to C7. We got A4. We got king down to G7, and then we finally have the novelty of the game, and it is E3. As I always tell you guys when I'm showing Catalans, like E3 is like a very, very like, you know, known thematic move in the Catalan. So, I mean, I'm really surprised that it's a novelty, but it is a novelty. You know, you are trying to put your pawns on dark squares so that your bishop can be, you know, completely movable. And, you know, this definitely is a weakness if you just leave it there. So it has to get babysat if you don't push the pawn somewhere. So we do see knight back to B7. We got king down to F1. We see knight to A5. And like I said, we're not worried about the knight taking, because if the knight takes, we're going to be taken back with the pawn. And we just have a really, really nice pawn here. So we do see king to E2. We got knight back to D7. We got F4, H6, H4. Pawn takes H4, pawn takes H4, and we have king back to F8. We see rook over to D1. We got king back to G7. We see rook up to D4. And, I mean, everything is basically equal here in this position. You know, white and black, they don't really have anything, you know, either way that's really going to, like, force a win. You know, they have a similar pawn structure. You know, you got 2 here, 2 here, 1 here, 2 here. So, you know, everything is fairly even. White does have just a little bit more space, though. We do see knight to B3, knocking the rook, so the rook comes to C4. We see knight D to C5. We see knight to E5. We got F6, knight comes back to C6. Rook swings over to D7. We see knight down to D4. We see knight back to A5. Rook taking C5, so this is an exchange sacrifice. Kind of crazy, but you do get a lot of pawns for this sacrifice, so it's definitely very sound. And it's actually not one of the moves, but it gives you a little bit of niceness. So like I said, after pawn takes C5, you got knight taking E6 with check, the king sliding over to F7, and then we have knight taking C5. And, I mean, you are down the exchange, but you did get a couple of pawns, so you are up 2 pawns at this point now. So the rook comes over to C7. We see bishop to D5 with check. King goes over to E7. We see knight to E6. Rook comes down to C2. Very logical, trying to put the, you know, the pick on the 7th. But we do see king up to D3. And after rook comes to C1, we do see knight back down to D4. We see king up to F8. We got king up to E4. We see rook up to C3. We got H5. King comes to G7. We got knight to E6. King comes back to F7. You are moving yourself into that line of fire, but, I mean, there aren't really any good discoveries in this position. We see the knight coming back down to D4 with check. The king going back over to G7, and we are repeating at this point. But Wesley So actually has a complete win in this position. So if you want to go ahead and pause the video and see what move can give Wesley So the win, go ahead and do so. All right, so we saw how basically knight to E6 check kind of just made you repeat moves, right? But I feel like a lot of you guys would be noticing, okay, what happens if I go knight to F5 here? Doesn't it kind of force the king over because I'm going to be attacking this pawn? It kind of does, but what it also does is it clears. I'll show you. I got you. So after, okay, not that. Knight to F5 with check. The king would really have to step over to H7 because, like I said, this pawn is attacked and you don't want to have like a runaway pawn because you can protect it. So the king would slide over to D4 and get an attack on this rook, and it clears the way for this pawn to start moving. So after the rook comes down to C1, we actually see E4. And the major thing of this position is the fact that this bishop is completely controlling this knight. As you can see, this knight really doesn't have anywhere to go. This is a very common in-game theme that some of you guys might have come across in your games when a bishop basically dominates a knight that's on the board, on the rim. Usually when you're in an opening or a middle game, the knights, you know, they're not really too bad on the edge because usually they redirect themselves into a better square. But when you're getting into an end game, and there's a lot less pieces, a bishop definitely has the ability to dominate a knight. And that's probably one of the reasons that makes a bishop a little bit better than a knight, because a knight doesn't have the ability to, just completely restrict a bishop, unless, of course, their own pawns are in the way or something like that. So this is super duper completely won for Wesley. So, but it is not what he actually did in the game. The king came to G7, and he actually went knight to C6. And the problem with knight to C6 is it actually like negates what I just got done saying. So this bishop is no longer controlling this knight, and this basically allows the knight to just get, out. So what you're hoping for is knight to take C6. Then you'll be able to take with the pawn, and then you'll start to kind of move your pieces in the way, and you can try to get this pawn to queen. But Levon is not going to do that. So we see knight coming to B7. Like I said, the knight is escaping its prison on A5. We see knight takes A7. Knight to C5, we see king over to D4. Knight takes A4, we see B6. Rook goes down to C1, because you do want to put as much distance as possible between you and the rook, or you and the king when you're trying to check. We got B7. The rook comes down to D1 with check. We see king to C4. We see rook to C1 with check. We see king to B4. Knight comes up to C5. And if I back up, there was actually another move that was actually considerably better in this position. Is actually king to b5. It's slightly more accurate because it allows you to actually win an entire piece. So after we see knight to c5, you can actually queen this pawn. And then after the rook checks on b1, which is the only thing you can do, the king will take on c5. And then after the rook takes b8, knight comes to c6. And you do have an entire piece, and you are up a pawn. So this is like very, very winning. But like I said, we did see king to b4 in the game. And then we have knight to c5. And you guys might be asking, well, why can't you just do the same thing here, right? Well, there is a very, very subtle difference between king to b4 and king to b5. And I'll show you exactly what that is. If you go in this position, instead of the king being here like before, and you queen the pawn, you actually have the ability to go knight to a6 with check. And it is because of the positioning of the king and the queen that now you don't win an entire piece. You don't have to check with the rook. You can check with the knight, and you're going to be picking up this queen. And it is a very, very small difference, but it makes a world of difference. So like I said, we did see knight to c5. The knight came back down to b5. We see knight up to d7. We see knight to d4. We see king up to f8. We got knight to f5. We see rook to c1 with check. The bishop covers on b3. We see rook to h1. We got king to b5. Rook takes h5. We see e4. The rook comes back down to h3, or it comes down to h3. We see bishop to c4. We got rook over to c3. Knight takes h6. We got king to e7. We see knight to f5 with check. The king goes back to d8. We see bishop to e6. The knight comes back to b8. We see bishop to d5, just protecting the pawn. We see king down to c7. Knight to d4. We see rook down to c1. A knight to e6 with check. King comes down to d6. We see knight back down to d4. Knight to d7. We see knight down to b3. We got rook to f1. We got f5, just covering everything. So it kind of looks like, I mean, white is going to be able to force this home, but there's literally like so many different moves that you can use to draw. So we do see king up back to c7. We see bishop to e6. And then we actually see the position repeat 3 times. We see rook to b1. We see bishop to d5. Rook to d1. We see bishop to e6, rook back to b1, bishop to d5, rook back to d1, bishop to e6. After rook to b1 and bishop back to d5, you see the little halves on the kings, and it is drawn by threefold repetition. So it's crazy how Wesley had the game like won so many different times, but he just wasn't able to find the right course to make. And so he'll be kicking himself, just like how I forgot how to say his name. David, the other guy he played, how he had a winning move that he could have made, but he didn't. He missed it. So I guess it makes it even. I guess Wesley So's even for the day now. So that is that game. I appreciate you guys very much, and I will see you guys next time.